Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the 10 biggest selling prog artists, prog bands of all time, and I will be going in sales rank. So it is a ranking video, but in this case it's an objective ranking video, I hope, because I hope that my figures are correct. If you go out on the internet and Google, you know, the 10 biggest selling prog artists of all time, there is nowhere to find that. So I have spent the last week or so trying to calculate record sales of various progressive rock bands and then trying to keep a tally. And I think I've come up with a list. So this is hopefully information that's not readily out there. Well, it is now. And I'm going to go quite quickly through this list, and then I'm going to discuss why I did this and why I think this is actually quite important, because I think it changes the narrative on how we see progressive rock, and we can see a sort of inequality exists in terms of the critical discourse of rock music and progressive rock and its cultural impact and importance artistically. So if you're up for that more esoteric discussion, get to the end of the video. But for those of you who don't like me chatting for too long, I will now hammer my way through this list. Albeit in my case, it'll probably be a bit slower than you want, because I do witter on. That's the whole thing about my website, is it's all about waffle and wittering here. So if you're not into waffle and wittering, then you need to find another YouTuber. So just to give you a warning, but I will start. So at number 10 we have with 15 million album sales, the American progressive rock band Kansas. Now we have to deal with here with the concept of progressive rock bands from the United States of America, because in reality there aren't that many. It's an interesting anomaly when you look at the history of rock music, that rock and roll, rhythm and blues, soul, all these music forms originate in the United States of America. It's an American music form, really. But the British come along and they change the narrative in the 1960s. And we can see rock music as being American rock and roll, rhythm and blues, mixed with what I call the English aesthetic, English artistic interests, you know, which tend to be about whimsy, the individual, do-it-yourself aesthetics, surreal humour, bawdy humour. All these things sort of creep into rock music. And these bands become really huge. Now, if we look at those English aesthetic qualities, then what we find is that progressive rock seems to really represent that more than any other style of music. And it's interesting in that America has, not Canada, the United States of America has found it so difficult to really produce a groundbreaking out there progressive rock band that's also been very successful. Kansas, for me, are a derivative rock band. There are influences in there that are definitely American influences. They're extremely polished. The playing in a way is slicker and actually more competent, but maybe lacking the individuality that we see in guitarists like Robert Fripp or Steve Howe, or drummers like Bill Bruford or Carl Palmer. They are a little bit behind the narrative of progressive rock, but obviously with the release of Left Overture in the late 70s and their big hit Carry On My Wayward Son, I think that's contributed to them almost being seen on the side of sort of AOR as well as progressive rock, but they are a full-on progressive rock band. So that's what we have at number 10, is Kansas with 15 million, which I found quite interesting. Just before we move on, they are also just riding above Dream Theater, which I think have had about 12 million sales, and Marillion, that's had about 14-15 million sales. So they just pushed those out the way, which is great, because it means I don't have to talk about Marillion on this video, because I hate talking about Marillion. Because, as my mum always said, if you've got nothing good to say, then say nothing. And with that sentence, I have now just upset around about 40% of the viewers of this video. But shall we move on, shall we? So, and I did it deliberately. Right, so number 9, with 20 million album sales worldwide, we have Mike Oldfield. Mike Oldfield represents for me the sort of peak of progressive rock, where the music industry had got to a certain point where culturally some shy guy stuck that no one's heard of, that signed his first deal, is given a whole ton of money to sit in the studio and make whatever he wants, some instrumental sidelong insanity, right, with no restraints, no sort of commercial parameters put on this album, which then gets thrust onto the market, and this unknown artist then goes on to sell, with that album alone, something like 10, 15 million albums, and it becomes a worldwide success, ending up being on the soundtrack of one of the biggest horror films of the 1970s, right? This does not happen anymore, right? Mike Oldfield's success, obviously, this 20 million sales is all down to Tubular Bells, and I'm sure if we look to the follow-up of that, if you look at Hergest Ridge and Armageddon, we can probably see the sales dropping down. Although in recent times Mike Oldfield's been done a good job of being able to trade on the Tubular Bells sort of formula and go back and do that. Of course, he had a few hit records in the 1980s with songs that I can have tried to forget, and I have forgotten them. But very interesting, and a very interesting artist, I think. An anomaly, I've always felt. Who else is like Mike Oldfield? Of course, we have the Jean-Michel Jarres of the world. You know, we've got those types. But they're much more slicker and knowing. Mike Oldfield always seems to embody some sort of introverted anxiety, the sort of thing that Nick Drake also had. I feel that Mike Oldfield's roots are in that world as well. So very interesting artist. So that's what we've got at number 9 is Mike Oldfield with 20 million album sales. Right, at number 8 we have the mighty Yes with 30 million albums sold. Right, now when I saw that figure, I thought, well, that's all because of 90125, you know, and can I really class that as a sort of progressive rock triumph? Can I really do that? And then I went back in and I looked, and it's not the case. Yes sold for a long period of time at a really high level, hit the top of the charts. Again, this is the whole Mike Oldfield thing. It's the wonderful thing about progressive rock, that music this challenging, this musically competent and interesting, for a short time was able to reach a mass audience and create a legacy which we are still talking about today. Yeah. That 30 million is spread out, and it's a huge number, and it pretty much dominates what we call the classic progressive rock bands. Yes, sold so much more than a King Crimson or a Gentle Giant or a Van de Graaff Generator. King Crimson's album sales of all time are just over 1 million. I tend to think as Yes and Genesis as being the same band. It seems a good move to me when Bill Bruford moved from Yes to Genesis. Oh, that makes quite sense. But he was moving from a 30 million album selling band to a 1 million selling out band. This is the thing that we don't realise. You know, there's a couple of bands on this list from the classic progressive rock era, and it's interesting. Some of them we would barely mention as being the great progressive rock bands, and some of them are quite obvious. So that's what we have at number 8 is Yes with 30 million. At number 7, another anomaly. Another band that is entirely unlike any other band on the planet. And that is, of course, Rush. The great progressive rock band from Canada. Canada have been able to produce progressive rock bands. I think their understanding of what I call the English aesthetic is much more apparent. And in Rush's case, they came over to Britain to search it out. Neil Peart had visited the UK before he became famous, travelling up and down, you know, going back to the source of what these guys saw as the beginnings of rock, their influences, The Who and Led Zeppelin. When they reached their progressive rock peak, on A Farewell to Kings, they actually came over to the UK and recorded that down in Rockfield, a studio that I have recorded in many a time. And I have been able to stand in the place where Alex Lifeson, in a bid to capture the woody pastoral feeling of England, although it's virtually Wales, took his guitar out on the courtyard, set a couple of microphones up and walked from one end to the other whilst playing the classical guitar intro that sounds like some Elizabethan madrigal to Farewell to Kings. This is a band that understand the English aesthetic, but they also have that American rock and roll thing, which a lot of the British progressive rock bands didn't have. They were far more whimsical. Rush know how to write a riff. You put that together and you have not only a band that has sold 40 million albums worldwide, but also a band that has laid the groundworks for so many rock bands that will not get discussed in this list, although I will come to them in a bit. But without Rush, there's a couple of bands here that have a combined sales, what would it be, of 225 million sales off just these two bands that would not exist without Rush. This is the legacy of progressive rock, and this is the thing nobody wants to talk about. At number 6, and it's actually they're pretty much the same in number of sales as Rush, we have Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Emerson, Lake and Palmer are almost like the British Rush. They are the bombastic progressive rock band, although they never had a guitar hero. You know, their guitar hero was Keith Emerson on keyboards. They take that bombastic aesthetic of progressive rock and they push it to the max. And when I was younger, and anybody who's watched this YouTube for a number of years will realise when I started doing this, I was a little bit negative towards ELP, although when I was younger I absolutely loved them. But that sort of cheeky Chaz and Dave aesthetic that sometimes emerges with ELP, mixed with a sort of outlandish bombast which seems to have no limits, you know, that these guys are just what would be the word, opulent, and I don't think ELB are pretentious at all. They're opulent and wasteful almost aesthetically. But of course, what I realise now is ELP were out to entertain, and they were out to entertain their audiences in a different way. They were going to entertain their audiences with bombast. How much was their tongue in their cheek? I think quite a lot. But underneath that was a band with incredible musical ability and with a really advanced compositional approach, which I think came from Keith Emerson, and then a penchant for pop songs and good hooks, which came from Greg Lake, and then of course the prototype, you know, showboating drummer of all time. You know, when Tommy Lee is sat there in his drum kit strapped in, turning upside down on stage, there's a lineage that goes back through to Carl Palmer and then eventually goes back to Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich. You know, there's a line, and so they're almost like the perfect trio, and I've learned to appreciate ELP as time has gone on. So that's who I have at number 6, is ELP with 40 million sales. At number 5 we have Jethro Tull. Now Jethro Tull may have made a few dodgy albums in the 1980s, but Jethro Tull are not a band that have relinquished their progressive rock credentials. They have traversed a path which is difficult, challenging. They have mined the blues, they have mined English medieval music and folk music. They have pulled all these things together in a way that I can't think of any other band. You know, at the height of the 70s, when Led Zeppelin was strutting about, you know, doing lots of trouser work, there you had Ian Anderson stood on one leg, looking like some, you know, 19th century farmhand with a sort of a waistcoat and a cloth cap, straggly beard, you know, gurning at the audience like some mad fool, like some weird, you know, pastoral jester of Prog, which is about the most progressive thing you can be. And it's interesting for me because Jethro Tull are never the go-to band, you know. They're huge. They've made Thick as a Brick, Minstrel in the Gallery, you know. They've made A Passion Play. They've made Songs from the Wood, Aqualung. These are like just monstrous progressive rock albums that sold tons. And I've always found it interesting that if you went up to someone and say, name some 70s prog bands. Oh yes, Genesis, King Crimson, Pink Floyd. Those are the ones we go to. Jethro Tull are far more prog than Pink Floyd are. And yet we don't seem to put them in the club. And then we're faced with these record sales. Jethro Tull are way bigger than ELP, Rush and Yes by 20 million sales. At number 3, and I didn't know whether to put them on the list, but I decided to, because this is number 3, the third biggest selling progressive rock band of all time, is from Birmingham, the Moody Blues. It's the Moody Blues. Birmingham does it again. We always do. Here we come in. Now, the Moody Blues, they are quintessentially important in the history of progressive rock with their Days of Future Past album. I think with the Moody Blues is their aesthetic is so progressive, but it is their own aesthetic, and it is so much more linked to songwriting and Justin Hayward's beautiful voice that I feel that, of course, we see them on the lighter side of progressive rock. You know, we don't get any Starless and the Bible Blacks from the Moody Blues, but I think especially throughout the 70s, they are undoubtedly a progressive rock band, and the early albums, without a doubt, put them there. Now, the fact that they've written such beautiful songs, I mean, able to cross over, we could say, well, does that make them prog? Well, I think there is something in progressive rock which is very attractive, and it comes from the Beatles. You know, bands that came in, like the Moody Blues, but also bands like ELO, another band that I haven't classed on here, which I imagine has a similar record sales to the Moody Blues. Maybe I think ELO come in at around about 80 million. I haven't put them on this list. Are they a progressive rock band? I think there is an aspect to progressive rock that informed pop songwriting, and I think when a lot of these progressive rock bands drew themselves in, they were able then to write very catchy pop rock songs because of their ability to inflict whimsy and that sort of light fun into the music, which of course is pop music. And I think here in the UK, the big pop stars that we had in the early 80s had exactly the same aesthetic, from Frankie Goes to Hollywood to ABC. They had the same aesthetic that comes from this end of the progressive rock world. And to deny it is to do a disservice to this incredible genre that we love and that we should be championing. So that is my reason for letting the Moody Blues in. What's my reason for not letting ELO in? I don't know. You forgot ELO, Andy. No, I didn't. You know, I am good mates with Bev Bevan, the drummer of ELO. I've worked with him for a number of years, and my best friend, my greatest friend and ally of all time, is Mr. Rob Growcut, who is, of course, the son of Kelly Growcut. I have grown up, especially in the last few years, in the shadow of ELO, and so I am quite aware of what they do. My gut feeling is not to put them on this list, and I know I'll get shouted at. Talking about bands that cross over from making great big progressive rock epics to, you know, snappy, sort of yuppie pop songs. We have at number 2 Genesis with 100 million album sales. And what we haven't factored in here is Phil Collins' album sales as well, which is 150 million. Now, in this case, I'm very aware that this is not coming from the progressive rock end of Genesis. This is coming from the rolled up sleeve, suit wearing, pastel shaded, mulleted Genesis of the 1980s. The Genesis that everybody hates. We all know that there is the Steve Hackett Genesis and there is the no Steve Hackett Genesis. And everybody watching this channel, on the whole, likes the Steve Hackett Genesis, don't they? And so this seems a bit of a cheat to have them here at 100 million. What's been interesting for me as I've got older is to be able to go back to albums like Genesis and Invisible Touch, and even, you know, We Can't Dance or whatever it's called, and even Calling All Stations, and hear that technically, compositionally, harmonically, they do not change in their approach. It's still Genesis. And they are the best example, I think, of a progressive rock band which has all the whimsy of the English aesthetic, drawing in successfully what they did and becoming a huge artist in the 1970s. Now, this is comparable to two other bands. The two other bands that are also really successful in bringing in this sort of woody pastoral English aesthetic, which would be Jethro Tull, and then another English aesthetic which is very heavy, is Van der Graaf Generator. Now, what Van der Graaf Generator do, which is interesting, is, especially with Peter Hamill's solo albums, is he really forges the groundworks for British punk, right? It's just there in that. And Genesis have the groundworks for British pop music. So a lot of those electronica bands like Yazoo and Erasure, if you look at their influences, a lot of that came from early Genesis, Tears for Fears. So these bands are very important to popular music in the 1980s, and that is coming out from their progressive rock aesthetic. I will talk about this in a bit more depth when we get to the number one. Now, who do you think's at number one with 250 million album sales? Well, it's of course Pink Floyd. And that is down to two albums, I would say, primarily. It would be, of course, The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. Now, Dark Side of the Moon is like about the most proggiest album you should get. And those of you who are now shouting at me that Pink Floyd are not a progressive rock band because you are shallow enough to think that, you know, musical competency and technical ability is what makes a progressive rock band, well, you're wrong, because if that's the case, all jazz and all classical music and all session music and all musical music is all progressive rock. It's not about how hard it is to play. That is not what makes progressive rock. I've done a whole video on this if you want to have a dig around and find it. I used to put a little link up here when I mentioned the video. I don't anymore. You can go and search for it. I don't care. Right? I've gone here, I've been there, done that. Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd, what am I going to say about them? When I did my history of progressive rock, at every stage of the history of progressive rock, up until around about 1987, they represented what was going on. You know, Piper at the Gates of Dawn is one of the first progressive rock albums in history. You know, it's way before in terms of rock and roll history. It's before In the Court of the Crimson King. They are there representing it. And then the experimentation that progressive rock bands go through, Pink Floyd become the most avant-garde, the most experimental. And then when we go into the era of epics and we're seeing Thick as a Brick released and Close to the Edge, Pink Floyd then returned with the greatest progressive rock epic of all time, Dark Side of the Moon. And then when prog starts to draw itself in, and it starts to draw itself in before punk happens, we'll get onto this in a minute, when that happens, they return with Wish You Were Here, which is prog drawn in, Animals, which is full-on prog, and they're still selling a ton of records. And then with The Wall, which is not an album I'm really keen of, I think is why is The Wall so huge? It's because of what it represents, of what it caught at the time. It caught, especially here in the UK, it caught the zeitgeist as much as punk did. In my sort of cultural framework of being about 11 years old when The Wall came out, that sort of anti-establishment-ness was far more apparent in, you know, Another Brick in the Wall and the video that went with that than watching, you know, Sid Vicious, you know, doing Come On Everybody and sat on the back of that motorbike. because that was the first time I ever became really aware of punk, apart from loads of weirdos walking around my town with, you know, Mohicans or whatever they had, spiky orange hair, you know. So culturally, Pink Floyd changed and they moved. By the time we get to the 1980s and prog has been so corporatized and turned into dad music, which is really what happens there. they are the vanguard of that. They represent that so well. And the fight between the songwriter and the sort of cultural weight of Roger Waters and what he became, and then the sort of beauty of that ethereal sort of dad rock sound of Dave Gilmour, that fight being played out is a fight that happened in the history of progressive rock. So that's what I got at number 1 at Pink Floyd. Right, some honourable mentions. Supertramp. Should Supertramp be on the list? Because that would change it. They have had 70 million album sales, right? Peter Gabriel. Is Peter Gabriel really prog? I thought. To the general public, he is far more known as a solo artist when he left Genesis. But when we look at it, it's a reasonable amount. He's sold 16 million albums, but nowhere near what I thought. And I would imagine that is almost entirely down to So, isn't it? And it's down to Sledgehammer. Here's an interesting one. Iron Maiden. I think that Iron Maiden are without a doubt a progressive rock band. Without a doubt. They come out of bands like Led Zeppelin, and they come out of bands like Judas Priest and UFO. Of course they do. But there is so much they take from progressive rock. So much. The storytelling, the long form composition, the virtuosity, the sort of complexity, the English aesthetic, whimsy. It's all there in Iron Maiden stuff. Like I said, this is Rush. This is what Rush brought, and to some extent King Crimson. That their influx of progressive rockness comes in and makes heavy rock heavy metal. That's the thing that comes in. The other band which follows on from that is Metallica, that surprisingly have not sold as much as Iron Maiden. They have sold 125 million albums worldwide. Iron Maiden have sold more. Iron Maiden should be a national treasure here in the UK. They should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. All right? They are huge, and there they can go off with their own, Boeing 747 around the world. They are still selling out huge venues. It's one of the biggest bands in the world. But don't you feel like they're ignored? Do you feel that? Do you feel like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has ignored them? That the media has ignored them? They've been sidelined. If I walked out my house now and threw a stone, it wouldn't take long for that stone to hit an Iron Maiden fan. I am a huge Iron Maiden fan. Are you a huge Iron Maiden fan? How many of us are here because of Iron Maiden? Why is Iron Maiden marginalised for a band that is so huge? Of course, they're nowhere near as huge as Led Zeppelin. And I'll just say, I know I always say, but I get comments and people don't realise that I was Robert Plant's drummer for a while, so they'll go, you know nothing about Led Zeppelin. I think, well, hang on, I do. So, it shocks me to know that I drummed for the lead singer of a band that has sold 300 million albums. Now, Led Zeppelin, a progressive rock band. Yes, they are. I don't think Robert Plant would like to hear that, mind, but they are a progressive rock band. And in fact, they're pioneers of progressive rock. Tracks like Dazed and Confused and How Many More Times and Babe, I'm Going to Leave You Off the first album. There is so much there that goes to inform progressive rock. The middle section of Whole Lot of Love, one of their most famous songs, is as more experimental than anything King Crimson or Van der Graaf Generator ever did. Led Zeppelin 3 takes on the English aesthetic. It takes on those influences from the Incredible String Band and Fairport Convention and Pentangle and winds those back into rock at the same time when Jethro Tull and Genesis are doing the same thing. And of course Led Zepp 4, Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti, especially Houses of the Holy. Houses of the Holy is out without a doubt their album, which comes from 1973, the peak year of progressive rock, and it is another peak progressive rock album. Led Zeppelin are a progressive rock album, a progressive rock band. And if we were to put these people I'm talking about, which also includes Jimi Hendrix, is Jimi Hendrix progressive rock? Because Jimi Hendrix has sold an incredible 195 million albums. For an artist that it really had about 3 years of productive time on this planet, this is incredible. Really incredible. And I think the progressive rock world owes a debt to Jimi Hendrix, which is not discussed enough. Another one I've got on the list here is War of the Worlds, Jeff Wayne's disco prog album from 1978, a double disc, one track basically over two sides, which tells the story of War of the Worlds. You can't get more proggy or British than this. And that album, that single album, has sold 15 million copies. If we start to add this up, we're now getting into the realms with these bands, 1 billion album sales. But of course, we shouldn't really be mentioning any of these bands because, well, it's a bit pretentious, isn't it? Progressive rock. It was a dead end, wasn't it? It was like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. They were brilliant bands in the 1970s. But then white English people got hold of it and they pushed it to a thing which was just elitist and pretentious, wasn't it? And far too clever. Who do they think they are? Taking their inspiration from philosophy and English literature. How dare they? It was pretentious, but of course, good working class people, like the Clash, which weren't working class, good working class, people, they took rock back to its rock and roll roots, the visceral sound of rock music, and showed all these bands rock up, didn't they? They showed them all up. 1976 and then 1977, the year of punk. Oh, all the prog bands, what are we going to do? Punk's come along, we can't operate anymore. We don't know what to do. They've turned us into dinosaurs. We need to go away and die in a hovel. And progressive rock died. And punk came and re-energized the music scene, leading on to all this incredible music in the 1980s. All this wonderful stuff like Erasure and Visage and Bronski Beat and all that type of stuff. Right? That narrative, which means that every time progressive rock is ever mentioned on the television or in any sort of mainstream media, you know what you're going to get. A laughing, knowing nod of people who are too cool for school whilst they stick up videos of ELP driving along with their juggernauts with Emerson, Lake and Palmer written on the top, and they point out the fact that nobody could actually see that. But they don't point the fact out that Emerson, Lake and Palmer knew that. Right? They knew that. Because that was the joke. That progressive rock on the whole, right? In some cases, I think definitely with Jethro Tull, definitely with ELP, with all the Canterbury bands, never took itself too seriously. Now, did Yes and Van der Graaf Generator take themselves very seriously? They did, yes, they did, without a doubt. And there was some snotty sniffiness there, without a doubt. There was some elitism there. But the progressive rock project that starts around about 1967-68, by 1973, the bands themselves were aware of what was going on. And as I say, there's artists like Peter Hamill. Is the album Nadia's Ghost? I'm not very knowledgeable on Peter Hamill, but I think Nadia's Ghost, you could hear on that solo album him solving the problems of where progressive rock should go next. King Crimson, Larks, Tongues and Aspic, Stars of Bible Black and then finally Red. That band is renegotiating what progressive rock is about. The move from Dark Side of the Moon to Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, they know it. By 75, prog is no longer what it was before. They made that change, right? And a lot of the aesthetics that came out of punk rock were rooted in progressive rock. For me, it's all part of the same push. Have artists come along in styles of music and reimagined and fought against the background? Did not the beboppers do that in the 1940s against swing jazz and traditional jazz? Did not who else would have done that? I had one in my head and it's gone now. I'll think of it. Hang on, just give me some time. Who was I just going to say? Get your brain in gear. When you get old, you just cannot remember anything. But another style of music where, like grunge, there we got it. That 1980s rock music was all either thrash metal like Slayer, or it was all like Bon Jovi and all the lipstick wearing, big haired metal bands that existed in the late 80s. And then Nirvana come out and Soundgarden and all those bands, they come out opposed to that. But nobody then says, yeah, but this isn't part of that genre. You know, and sometimes genres grow out of older genres and they do change and it needs to be given a different name, and punk is undoubtedly the case. But let us not deny that its DNA is far more rooted in progressive rock as it is based in, say, disco music or James Brown. Right? That's the lineage. It's all part of the same movement. But if we look at the Sex Pistols and we look at their album sales, we are talking about a band that is probably on the same level as a King Crimson. None of those punk bands sold that much, and they're dwarfed by the progressive rock bands. And if you want to say, yeah, but punk didn't last for very long, if we would just take 1977 and we look at albums like Animals by Pink Floyd, or Yes's Going for the One, or the following year War of the Worlds, you know, or the Genesis albums that were coming out through that time, if we start to add up those sales that just were happening when punk was happening, they too dwarf punk's album sales. Punk is an incredible genre. I absolutely love the Sex Pistols. I love the Clash. I'm going to see John Lydon in May, and I have asked him to come and do an interview on this channel because I want to talk to him about his progressive rock influences. I want to explore how musically adept that guy is. He's one of the great British poets. He's one of the great visionaries of English music, without a doubt. And what he was pulling from and the things he brought in, things from Shakespeare, things from American punk, things from Peter Hamill, right? Things from David Bowie, all sorts of different music he pulled in, and he had a filter. Yes, he wasn't pulling in from Pink Floyd, but I would love to talk about it, because if he wasn't pulling in from Pink Floyd, he must have been aware of that band enough to be able to sift through the influences. And surely some of the whimsy of Syd Barrett, how much is that there? I would love to talk about this. It's never really been exposed. And anyone who's involved in punk that I've managed to chat to always seem to be huge progressive rock fans. These sales are proof that at some point in, you know, world cultural history, popular music was able to create artists at the level of a Pink Floyd or a Genesis or a Moody Blues or a Jethro Tull or an ELP or a Rush or a Yes or a Mike Oldfield or Kansas or a Marillion or a Dream Theater or a Supertramp or a Peter Gabriel or an Iron Maiden or Metallica or a Led Zeppelin or a Jimi Hendrix, that were able to make popular music that reached real normal people and yet transmitted something of incredible artistic, you know, mastery, and from conceptually expanding the barriers of what we expect from popular music forms. And this is a little bit like the French New Wave cinema. We could see French New Wave cinema as the punk of cinema. The French New Wave recognised something in the Hollywood film system which they loved. And this was the idea of dividing film into the genre film, cowboy films, horror films, and the auteur films. That these were films that were made by John Ford or made by Alfred Hitchcock. And they saw that the director was so important and their vision was so important. And so the French New Wave took those Hollywood cliches and they questioned those in their filmmaking. But at the same time, they took the idea of the auteur and they put that in to French New Wave, thus changing film history. The influence on the French New Wave on American filmmaking then kicks filmmaking over, and we start to see films like Easy Rider, Bonnie and Clyde, and then we get like the sort of Scorsese thing, and we get that school of filmmakers that comes out, which eventually ends up with Star Wars and ends up with Spielberg, which is artists going back to that Hollywood system, but through the lens of the French New Wave. A little bit of film history there for you, right? I see that as a similar thing of what's happened here, but the thing is although the French New Wave questioned Hitchcock, Hollywood's film system, you know, the whole studio system, although they rebelled against it, the Hollywood film system created films like Casablanca. It created films like The Maltese Falcon. It created Citizen Kane. And these films are opulent, complex films, and yet they were able to reach a mass audience, you know, especially we say something like a John Ford film like The Searchers or the Hitchcock films. But these films are in depth, and our culture values that. But I'm afraid it hasn't happened for these progressive rock bands. It hasn't happened. And they are not talked in the same way, in the reverential tones that critics talk about Velvet Underground or the Stooges or The Clash or Joy Division, or when they used to talk about the Smiths in the same way. But of course, you know, what's his name? Morrissey became a right-wing fascist, didn't he? So they can't talk about him anything anymore, can they? They liked him when they didn't eat the meat. You know, Yes didn't eat the meat, did they? Rick Waitman ate a lot of meat. I imagine Rick Waitman made up for the lack of meat eating that was going on in Yes. And maybe it's Rick that has spoilt it for the critics who like to know that people aren't right-wing fascists but lovely vegans. And there, with that little paragraph, I realise I have got to the end of this video, haven't I? So I hope you enjoyed this little journey through the great, huge album sales that progressive rock have been able to draw from the world. And I hope those of you who are progressive rock fans will be sat there a little bit prouder knowing that this John we love has sold loads and loads of records, and we can be proud of that. It has done the most obscure, weird stuff going, but it's also been popular enough to sell around about 1 billion albums. It's not bad, is it? It's not bad for a bunch of blokes in capes, you know, standing on their Persian carpets with their juggernauts with their names on that nobody can read unless they got a helicopter. Thanks for watching this video. And before I go, I have to do it, everyone. If you like this video, I nearly was going to forget to do it then. If you like this video, press the like button. And if you press lots of like buttons on my videos, YouTube will go, ooh, people like Andy's videos. Maybe I'll stick him in the suggestions for other people. Because they got the algorithms, and all the middle-aged blokes, you know, that have sat there, you know, watching Jordan Peterson and then, you know, the story of Griffin. you know that sort of world. Don't say you're not that. I know you're that, right? They'll start suggesting it to some new ones. There's poor people like that. Poor middle-aged men sat all over the world, right? Whose wife doesn't want to listen to, you know, them talk about Gentle Giant's discography, that haven't discovered me yet. And if you like it, they might just spread it out to someone else, like you. So that's why it's so important. I'm creating an army here, a great army of progressive rock fans. We're going to take over the world at some point, right? The youth don't understand it. They need us old ones. We need to still save the day. We need to save the day. So press the like button. That's all you have to do. Right? And if you want to become part of my, you know, great progressive rock army, then you need to subscribe, don't you? Now, I do have an actual army. It's called my patrons. Now, my patrons are a lovely bunch. There's around about 150 of them. I think 112 of them are paying. What happens if you become a patron and you don't pay? I don't think you get anything at all. I think it's just basically you can say you're part of my club and that is it. But those who do pay are part of the club, and we get together every couple of weeks. We have a chat online. There's loads of content I put up. There's all sorts of different things that go on that. And, you know, it's becoming a little family. It's my little progressive rock army. And when I've raised enough, you know, in true English spirit, I will take the government down. Right, you've got to remember, we may seem like a little dotty country to you out there that aren't from England. But before the Americans did it, before the French did it, before the Russians did it, before any of them had their revolutions, we in England, we had the first revolution, right? The English Revolution, the English Civil War, and then we got our king and we cut his head off We're the first. And how do we commemorate that? By naming every pub after that decapitated head. And you could drive through the countryside of England and decide to pull over having a lovely pork pie and half a pint of bitter in a venue called the King's Head after the decapitated head of King Charles I. Right? This is something to remember. And I'm going to raise an army of progressive rock fans, and we're going to go and cut the head off Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, because what have any of them done to us or for us? Probably quite a bit. So that was my slightly surreal sell of Patreon. And what else can you do? If you don't want to join my army and take over England and start another revolution, so we can create a progressive rock utopian heaven here in England, then you could just put some money in my PayPal tip jar, and that would be a wonderful thing. I have definitely come to the end of the video now. That is Monday's video done. The 10 biggest selling progressive rock bands of all time. I'm now going to go in and have a nice cup of tea. I'm going to have a pork pie, and I am going to consider, I may have a Scotch egg. Now you'll say, Andy, a Scotch egg? They're Scottish. No, they're not. Scotch eggs are not Scottish. They're from someplace up north, but they're not Scottish at all. Scotch eggs are English. Now, the name, where it comes from, nobody's quite sure. Such is the mystery of the Scotch egg. You know what I'm going to do now? I really do fancy a Scotch egg. So I'm going to switch the camera off and I'm going to go and buy myself a Scotch egg. I will be back in a moment, and then I will be able to talk to the people of the rest of the world about the wonderful attributes of the Scotch egg. So if you want to stick around for that, I'll be back in a little bit. So, you know, hold your horses. Welcome back. I'm glad you stayed around for the little postscript where I am about to just celebrate and inform the world about the wonderful culinary attributes of the incredible Scotch egg. Now, a Scotch egg is basically a boiled egg wrapped in sausage meat. Nobody really knows where they came from. Okay? And I don't know this. I've got some notes here now. I've gone and done a little bit of research. Gone on Wikipedia. So they seem to originate from around about 1809. And there's an edition of Maria Rundle's A New System of Domestic Cookery, which mentions the Scotch egg. At that time, they did not have a breadcrumb layer. Although by 1861, Isabella Beeton, yes, Mrs. Beeton, had suggested this as an option. They may be based upon Indian koftas, but if they are, it is a very English version of Indian food. Other people think that they were invented in Fortnum's. And there's another theory that they actually were originated from Whitby, where a factory started making these boiled egg and sausage meat combinations. And the company that sold them was William J. Scott and Sons, hence the name Scotch Eggs, after the person, not the country. There's another idea that it actually originated in scorched eggs, in other words, cooked over an open flame. So I've given you a little bit of background about the Scotch egg, and I know you want to see a Scotch egg, and I have got two here, in fact, that I've just gone and purchased. So I've gone and actually got Tesco's finest Scotch eggs. Can you see that? A bit of advertising with Tesco's, because they need it, don't they? Now, I normally wouldn't go for the finest Scotch eggs because I think it's too opulent to do that. When I go into Tesco's, I tend to stick to in more my financial realm. But I was very lucky when I just went up, and these, which are obviously on the turn of becoming rotten, okay, have been reduced from £2.90 to £1.51. So I was very lucky to locate these cheaper, finest Scotch eggs. Now I'm going to open up the packet here, and we will start. I just have to get my teeth involved in. Oh, beautiful smell, the beautiful smell of the Scotch egg. So this is what we're basically dealing with, a sort of spherical ginger ball, right? This could be seen as representing the earth, okay? So imagine that is the earth. Now, we cannot eat this. You could just bite into it like an apple, but it's not an apple. It needs to be sliced. I've got a plate here. I've gone for this plate, which is very sort of English kitchen, you know, look. I'm going to place it there. I've placed the Scotch egg onto the plate. Now I'm just going to get a knife. I've got this knife here. This is my Scotch egg cutting knife. It's short and sharp. It has a serrated edge, can you see, which will be able to deal with the breadcrumb outer, the sausage meat sort of magma belts, and then the internal, you know, actual egg part. This serrated edge is going to be able to deal with all of those, creating a reasonable slice through the Scotch egg, which I'll now do now. And you ready to see this? Okay, I'm pushing down. There we go, straight through. Oh, revealing a sight of an aesthetic pleasure. Look at that. Now, as I stare at you through my Scotch egg eyes, please remember that under no circumstances would Rick Beato ever do this, right? And that's the difference between mine and his channel. So get over there and tell him, right? Because when it comes to music YouTubing, this is the sort of quality content that I think people want to see. Now I've done this, right? Are you still there? Are you still there? Right, so this is Scotch egg. Now, if you look at it, it's quite interesting because what we have here is a circle with a dot inside it, don't we? And now, on Sunday, I did a video where I tried to prove that God existed. Now, I'm not too sure whether God exists or not, but I thought I'd have a go at it on YouTube because I thought it was something to do on a Sunday afternoon. And at the end, I talked about the monad. And the monad is where the great binary of the world, or the dialectic, merges into one. It's the sublime one, and that is represented by a circle with a dot inside. And I'm pretty sure that the Scotch egg was created, right, and this is an English esoteric symbol, so that everybody that lives in England, those in the know with that secret initiative secret knowledge, right, if ever they wanted to be reminded of the oneness of the world, they could slice into the Scotch egg, revealing the monad. But what is this monad? It's basically the ovum of a chicken encased in meat. This represents the feminine, right? This is the dialectic. It's the feminine. And then when I take the trusty sword, right, the sword that represents the protection of the British Isles by force. You know, when anything happens in England, anything like the Queen dies or the King goes on the throne, someone gets married, what do the British do? We parade all our soldiers, but not the new soldiers, the soldiers from back in the 19th century. And then they go popping on with all their feathers, with their sharp implements here. The sword that is represented by the spade in the pack of cards. The 1/4 of the corner of what initiates power, male power and feminine egginess, right? All represented in one. As that slice goes, that's why it's so, but you can't just bite into it. You have to slice it with the knife. Now, I'm now going to tell you how to eat it. You could just eat it raw, but in Britain we have a whole host of different condiments that could be added to it, and I suggest you do add some condiments to it. Now, the obvious one is English mustard. Now, some of you may, you know, think that you could use French mustard. Of course you cannot use French mustard. Disgusting stuff. Needs to be English mustard, but you could have a pickle with it, maybe some salad cream, right? Salad cream would definitely be the choice of the working class, the good, solid British working class, and that would be a wonderful combination for me. But I have gone for something which only aficionado would really go for, and I don't suggest this for you sort of new to the Scotch egg. This is something that, you know, only an expert can really deal with. I have got Coronation chicken juice, right? It's the stuff that goes in Coronation chicken, the great British yellowy sort of sandwich filler that was created for the Coronation in 1953. And so by having this, it takes me back to the great Coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to squirt a little bit of this onto the plate. Right, so I've got a little dab of Coronation juice here. Right, there it is on the plate. You see that? Only a certain amount. I have the Scotch egg face down, you know, so no eel can enter into the exposed innards. And I'm now just, watch this, I'm going to dip this in there like that, little bit like that. No need for a knife and fork, so this is entirely portable. You could take this anywhere if you go to some sort of picnic or sort of political demonstration, you know, or funeral perhaps, and you're bit nibbly and you want something to eat. You can pull this out as long as you've got a plate, somewhere to put your condiment sauces, whatever, and a sharp knife with a serrated edge. Now I'm going to eat it now. And if you just watch out for my expression as this goes in, you will be able to delight. Well, you won't be able to delight. You can watch my delight in this English culinary feast with all this esoteric symbologism. Breadcrumb, starch, sausage meat, protein, eggy, more protein. It's got all the food groups you need here. You can survive on this. If you only ate Scotch eggs, you could survive for at least 3 weeks before or the lack of all the other food groups that it doesn't have starts to kick in. But you'll be able to get by with that. Very useful thing. So, thanks for coming to this postscript to this video. I may well put this video out as a separate little video, because when I went up to the shop to get my Scotch egg, I thought, this is an important thing. I've stumbled upon an important thing here and I really do need to tell the world. So I'm going to put this out as a separate video called, What is the Scotch egg and why is it so great? Thanks for watching.